computer.
Okay.
Welcome, Hal. Welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. My guest today is Emily Strasser, and she has written the book, The Half-Life of a Secret. And Emily, it's been about a year now since it's been out?
Yeah, it came out almost exactly a year ago on April 4th
How
last.
about that? Yeah. Well, some things have changed in a year, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's been a big year.
It has, absolutely. Tell us about some of the things. Now, eventually, we want to get to your award that you just received. And oh, by the way, let me just start with that. Give me just a second and see if I can do this. I think I can. Do you see my screen?
I do, yes.
All right. This is the 2024 Reed Environmental Writing Award winner with Half-Life of a Secret by Emily Strasser. And it talks about the Southern Environmental Law Center is the one that presents the Reed Environmental Writing Award. And Emily was one of those who received the award. And it says that her book examines the toxic legacy of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of three secret cities constructed by the Manhattan Project for developing the first atomic bomb. She exposes a suppressed history that forever impacted her family, the community, the nation, and the world. I wanted to read that because I think it is well stated. And I think there's more to your book. And I have looked at it again recently, and let me show you something. You'll be amazed when you see what I've done. You see all of those
Love
little
it. I love a well flagged book. Yeah, that's great.
okay. So there are things in there that I wanted to tag and that have information that I've been able to use and learn from.
No.
I really do appreciate the work that you've done. I think it is I think it is giving an insight into the life you lived or are living, but also into your grandfather that would not have been shared if you hadn't taken the time to do the research and to share your experience. So tell us a little about what's been going on in this past year, and then let's come up to the award. I do want you to give us the talk that you gave at when you received the award, but there may be some other things you want to say to uh, preview what's been going on for the past year before we get to that. Okay.
Sure, I could do that. Do you think it would help to talk briefly about what the book is about? I mean,
Yeah, please do.
you haven't read it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So my grandfather, George Strasser, was I usually have to explain what Oak Ridge is, but when I give an intro, but I don't think I have to for this audience.
Yeah.
So he worked at Y12 starting in 1943. He was a chemist, worked actually alongside Bill Wilcox. I'm sure folks have heard of that name before.
Right.
Um, and I was grateful I was able to speak to him and hear some of what my grandfather did during World War II. And I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. And so when I was a young adult about to graduate college, I started to, you know, be curious and kind of haunted, by this legacy, to be honest, and the connection to what I would call an atrocity in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this was intertwined with my grandfather had pretty severe mental illness that, was something that it wasn't a secret exactly, but it was not really talked about either. It was one of these things that, you kind of say by the by and just move along, right? And so I got interested in like, what are the ways this city that was literally built as a secret, right? Where people were, during the war, compartmentalization was the name of the game. You didn't know anything beyond what you were doing. And then even after the war, that kind of culture continues. And I think it gets internalized by people. And so I became curious about like, how was that secrecy resonating with the secrecy in my family about mental illness? Were these things connected? How were they parallel? So yeah, so I dove in and spent about 10 years researching the history of my family, the history of Oak Ridge. I traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as part of my research. I spent a lot of time in Oak Ridge talking to different people. Ray Smith was one of the people I talked to and helped connect me with some resources and details. You were a great resource because whenever I had a question that was really in the weeds, I was like, who do I ask about this? Probably Ray Smith might know. And you were able to help me with some things. So that was really great.
I was glad to do that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the book in a nutshell. The year has been a big one. I was really nervous when the book came out. It's about real people. It's about sensitive subjects. You know, it's about subjects that maybe a lot of people haven't talked about. And I didn't know how people would react. And also I'm an introvert like a lot of writers. And so giving public talks was not something that I was really excited about. My first reading, I felt like I was going to puke and pass out at the same time. I was shaking. My voice was shaking. And afterward, all my friends were like, oh, you did great. Couldn't tell you were nervous. And my brother was like, yeah, I could tell you were nervous. So that was, kind of obvious. But it got easier. And, I was just really grateful for the really generous reception and that I got everywhere I went. I did an event in Oak Ridge and people were really like lovely and curious. And in the last year have heard from folks who've read the book, both people from my life, but people not from my life who've, heard of it. I've been invited to speak at college classes and gotten emails from people who found the book in different ways, who've said, oh, this, like, I have a history like this, a family history like this, or my relative was involved in this kind of work. You wouldn't believe it. Like almost every reading I do, someone has like an Oak Ridge connection or a Manhattan, at least like a Manhattan Project connection, so it's sometimes I say that and people laugh, and then there's like one or two who come up to me and they're like, it's me. I have that connection. So yeah, that's been really it's been really gratifying. You work on something really hard, to see it received generously is really heartening, and so I can go into the Reed Award now, I guess.
Before you do, let's take
Yeah.
just a moment and reflect on something that's key in your book, and
Sure.
that's the photograph.
Oh,
Talk
yeah.
about that just a
I did
little.
not tell you about the photograph. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I usually do talk about that, and I don't know why I skipped it. Yeah, so the first image of the book, and I could actually read the first page. Would that
Sure. Go
be
ahead.
like
That'd
that?
be good. Yeah. I
Okay.
think it
Then
would.
I can talk about what it is.
Yeah.
This is the very opening of the book. It began with a bloom of fire on an off-white wall. The light swelled, blinding yellow darkening to a smoldering orange, all of it surging up from a nest of angry black smoke. There it burned, even the night singed red around the fireball, suspended, frozen in its incandescence within the dull rectangle of a plastic picture frame. At the center of the bright, billowing thing was the darker shape of a man, arms loose at his sides, stance relaxed. He blocked the light, stood unchanged by it, only the shiny parts of him admitting to some anomaly in the landscape. A glow of firelight on his glasses, a gleam on his bald head. Bald like my uncle, like my father, like the men of my family. He was George, the grandfather I'd never met, the man who died of a heart attack a few years before I was born, in the room next to where I now lay under yellow flowered sheets, transfixed by his image. I could see the photograph by the amber light of the security beam over the driveway below, the light that burned all night long, because out here in the country, night by itself was too dark. I stared and stared, a clenched thrill in my stomach. I felt myself floating, unmoored from time and space, drawn by my grandfather's eyes, eyes that knew everything yet said nothing, drawn to the desert where fire blossomed in silence, sprouting from a great featureless plain that could have been the end of the world or the beginning. When I shut my eyes, the fireball lingered like the impression of a bright light just switched off, branded red behind my eyelids. So that's the first page of the book. And so basically, this image hung in my grandmother's house. My grandmother lived on Watts-Bar Lake in Kingston, Tennessee. And it hung above the bed where I slept when I visited her. And, you know, like a child, you don't really think about what always, you know, you don't really question what's in your immediate surroundings. So we hadn't talked, you know, much about George's work, maybe at all. And it wasn't until I was older that I understood what this photograph showed, which was him standing in front of a nuclear test blast. And that image kind of came back to me with a sudden force when I was starting to think about this history. Well, I would say the image came back and then I started thinking about the history. Like the image was first. I was like, what was that? How did that exist? Like, why did they hang it on the wall? What was it about? And, you know, it was confusing to me because I grew up in a relatively like pacifist environment. You know, as I write in the book, I went to a Quaker school, like, you know, we weren't, even our like water guns didn't look like guns, you know, that was the level, right? So to have this image of a bomb on a wall, like, was really wild to me. And it didn't make sense with how I understood my family. So I started to investigate. And then I won't give away the whole journey of the photograph, but when I looked for it, I'll tell you this much, when I started to look for it, I couldn't find it initially. And it becomes a recurring image and a search that I do throughout the book.
And I think that's a really good thing that you've done. It's a unique approach, but the impression of that photograph on a young girl's mind has now matured into a young lady that's doing research and done research that brings out information that would not have been out otherwise. So thank you again for that. Now, let's transition to the award that you received, to the Reed Award. Tell me about that. And how did you get considered for it?
Yeah, so the Reed Award is it's given by the Southern Environmental Law Center, as you mentioned. I think it's been 30 years, I want to say, that they've given it out. So it's been a good long time. I could be wrong about that. I didn't double check. And named for their founder, or one of their founders. And its goal is to highlight sort of the beauty and challenges of the environment in the South. And I will say, it was a lovely surprise to get this award. I really care a lot about the environment. I always have since I was a little girl, like worried about recycling and crying when trees were cut down and, you know, like trying to rescue birds who fell out of their nests, right? Like that was always really important to me. But I didn't set out thinking I was writing an environmental book, right? Like I didn't know much of anything about like the Superfund side or the contamination or the mercury. When I started this book, it was all about, you know, it was about the history. I thought about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I thought about nuclear testing, but I didn't have any idea. And so that became a big focus of the book that I didn't anticipate. And I think, yeah, so you asked how I got considered. So you have to be nominated. I think my publisher like nominated me, but anyone you can self-nominate. I can't actually remember if I sent it in or if they sent it in. But yeah, they get a lot of submissions, and then there's a judging process. So there's quite a long list of judges, some of them, you know, writers and scholars I really admire. So that was really lovely to be chosen by those folks. Not people I know personally, but, you know, people whose names I know. Yeah. And, you know, I think it is a lovely recognition of when we talk about environment, it's not just like, oh, the mountain's over there, right? It's not just like separate from humans. The environment is the land in which we live and breathe, which includes like my little garden and my sidewalk out front and the trees in front of my house and cities as animals and things that are separate. And so I kind of appreciated that recognition in getting this award.
Yeah, and I watched you as the award was presented. It was available on Zoom. That's I always say Zoom's the only good thing to come out of COVID. So
Yeah.
we're able to do things like we're doing here. And I really appreciated what you had to say in your acceptance speech. So would you share that with us now?
Sure. Happy to. Let me just pull it up here.
Okay.
So I'll just say, of course, like it was written sort of for that day. So I'll skip the part where I say thanks, but I will, thank the Environmental Law Center for this award again.
Yeah.
Okay. Earlier today, I was invited by the Southern Environmental Law Center team to contribute to the My South segment of their publication, in which people describe their favorite natural places in the South. My first instinct, I'm sorry, my cats are fighting in the background. I don't know if you can hear them.
Oh, no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. My first instinct was that I didn't want to do it because it's complicated. When I think of my South, I think of my grandmother's house on Watts Bar Lake, a dammed arm of the Tennessee River in East Tennessee. I think of rolling hills and winding country roads, fence lines thick with wild blackberries, Queen Anne's lace, black-eyed Susan. I think of this landscape of my childhood where I felt most loved, whole, and free. And now I know this place is contaminated with mercury, cesium, and other chemical and radioactive materials from the nuclear weapons industry in nearby Oak Ridge, where my grandfather spent his career from World War II into the Cold War. Now I know that my grandfather, in a management role, played a hand in contaminating his home. I didn't want to talk about my South because I do not have a simple answer, because I still grieve the innocent love I once had for this place. That's funny, of course, because the whole reason I'm here is that I wrote a book about my complicated relationship to this place. This is not where the book started. It did start out of love for this place, haunted by a legacy of violence. But for a long time, I was looking outside and far away. When I thought of the violence of the bomb, I thought of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I thought of nuclear weapons testing and fallout in Nevada and the Pacific Islands. I thought of historical violence and existential threats to the future. I read, interviewed, and traveled widely. I looked everywhere but back home. I looked everywhere but here and now. I'm going to tell you something that's not in the book. Years ago, at the very beginning of this work, before I had any idea of the scope, I interviewed a close friend of my grandfather's. I was hoping to learn about my grandfather's mental illness, another buried thread of this story. I was trying to understand the way family and national secrets intersected. This man was soft-voiced, a protective friend, careful about what he said. A few days later, I was in the archives at the Oak Ridge Public Library when he called me. He told me in a low voice something about a whistleblower. That's Stephen Goff, for those who know. Mercury contamination, professional retribution. I took a few notes, thanked him, hung up. I felt sick, scared, and I put the information aside, returning to the map of wartime Oak Ridge I'd been studying. I was going in historical order, I told myself, but also I didn't want to know. It would be years before I would return to that thread. And then I would learn how, in the Cold War frenzy of the 1950s and 60s, hundreds of thousands of pounds of mercury were released into the air, land, and local waterways of Oak Ridge under the watch of my grandfather and others like him. Rushed practices and inadequate safety measures were justified as necessary in the race against the Soviets. And though workers and management knew the mercury was leaking, it was kept from the public, which was possible because of the strict security measures surrounding nuclear weapons work. The contamination was finally uncovered in the early 1980s, before I was born and just before my grandfather's death. The family friend who called me, he wasn't revealing anything not already in the public record. But his cautiousness, decades later, was indicative of the culture of secrecy in Oak Ridge, a culture created and maintained by the nuclear weapons industry in the name of national security. A culture that dampened conscience and sidestepped accountability. A culture internalized in families like my own. I now recognize that inheritance in my own fear of digging into this history. Eventually, I was able to track down one of my grandfather's old psychiatrists. He told me that my grandfather was tortured by guilt for his part in contaminating his home. This is something my grandfather never told his family. Secrecy separates us. When I put together the pieces, the story of Oak Ridge, with the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Nevada and the story of my family, what I learned was a reminder of our deep interconnectedness. That when we build bombs bound for elsewhere, we poison our own backyards, our own minds even. Local and planetary health are intimately tied. And we all have a stake in eliminating the forces of our own destruction, whether bombs, guns, or fossil fuels. As it turns out, no place on Earth is free from the fingerprints of nuclear weapons. Our stratosphere is still stitched in radioactive particles from nuclear testing. No place on Earth is pure, unmarked by human industry. So we have to look to our backyards. We can't give up on the hurt places we love best. We need to dig deep, uncover the complex and messy histories, and fight for the future. I'm grateful to the communities, activists, and organizations like SELC still fighting for Oak Ridge and other landscapes poisoned by our own hands. I'm grateful for this chance to share something of the South I love, complicated as it is. And I'll end like I ended there by reading a short selection. This is towards the end of the book. At night, the shift between the city and outside is sudden and startling. One moment, there are streetlights and strip malls, and then, just past the west gates, the empty white guardhouses that once controlled access to the K-25 plant. The road is dark, long and lonely, lined on either side by a gray smudge of trees. As I left town one night, my headlights flashed against the reflectors on the roadside barrier and the tape in the lane divider, structuring my path with a bright rhythm through the otherwise unnerving stretch of nothing. I turned on the radio, flipped through the channels. Top 40s, a local live bluegrass broadcast, several country music stations. Then there was the musical drawl of a radio preacher, and I paused. Philosophy tells you I can tell you more and more about less and less, but I can't save you, he said. Well, I'm here to tell you there's someone who can save you. I turned the radio off, and it was just the sound of my tires on the asphalt, the rush of air past my windows. Finally, there is no knowing, no certainty in a place with such widespread and complex contamination as Oak Ridge, in a place that has been steeped for years in an oppressive culture of secrecy. It comes down to a kind of faith in the body, in the numbers, in the institutions meant to protect us. I don't think the world can be reduced to numbers. In the cracks between the numbers are real lives, real bodies. There are the maybes and fears and what ifs. There are hazards we did not consent to face. I believe this land, these people were hurt. I believe it matters that the fish and the spiders still carry elevated concentrations of mercury that can be magnified through the food chain when eaten by birds and bats. that radioactive material still trickle into the streams and rivers that flow downstream. The Superfund mandated cleanup of Oak Ridge is due to be complete by 2047. What, I asked Dave Adler from the DOE, does it mean to be complete? That's a good question. He laughed and explained that it meant honoring all regulatory commitments to the state, to the EPA. But yes, he conceded, contaminated groundwater and waste burial grounds will require monitoring indefinitely. Toxic disasters, writes sociologist Kai Erickson, violate all the rules of plot. They never end. Invisible contaminants remain a part of the surroundings, absorbed into the grain of the landscape, the tissues of the body, and worst of all, the genetic material of the survivors. And all clear is never sounded. The book of accounts is never closed.
Thank you for doing that. I think that is a very insightful presentation that you made as you received that award. And I want to compliment you again for taking such a personal view of Oak Ridge from the viewpoint of someone whose family was there, grandfather was there, and intimately involved in the not only the Manhattan Project, but in the Cold War. I mean, the idea in 1955 that lithium was needed for the hydrogen bomb, and Y12 was selected as the place to separate that lithium six. And your grandfather, George Strasser, was responsible for that operation.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill Wilcox told me one time, he said, little is known about the Colex process, but it was just like a second Manhattan Project to the folks who were at Y12.
Yeah.
They understood the importance of providing that material. Yes, they brought the nation's entire supply, reserve supply of mercury to Y12, and it was used in the separation of lithium 6. And it was operated from 1955 to 1963. And yes, during that time there was leakage, and the East Fork of Poplar Creek actually has its headwaters right there in Y12. So that's where the contamination that really wasn't talked about until 1983, as you mentioned. But that's where it came from, and it has spread downstream all the way to the lake. So, and of course, there's studies been done on it, and there's some positives associated with it. I think the Oak Ridge National Laboratory has learned more about how to clean up mercury contamination than anywhere else in the world. And that knowledge is being shared, and other places, and there are others that are contaminated with mercury, have benefited from the experience of the cleanup efforts in Oak Ridge. And of course, cleanup in Oak Ridge goes even far beyond the mercury. As you mentioned, there are other contaminants that are considerable ones to consider, some of the solvents and some of the radioactive materials from some of the reactors especially. And all of that is fertile ground really for learning how to deal with it in a worldwide environment. Because as you mentioned, the atomic age started in 1940s, but it's here to stay.
Right. It's not going away. We can't just ignore it. It's not going away.
It's not. And of course, with the current environment in the world today, it looks like there's even an additional emphasis on building more nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, that, as we've often said, we hope they're never used again. But that threat resides with us. And although we in the United States can only control our own, we can't tell what's happening in the rest of the world. So it's a situation that we have to live with. And there are contaminants associated with it that we need to protect ourselves from and to clean up. By the way, talk just a little bit about your experience with the Kingston fly ash.
Sure. Yeah.
And
And I mean,
how did
just
you
to go
get
back to,
involved in that? Tell us how you
yeah,
got into that.
yeah, just to follow up on, something you said, I think you're right. The threat of nuclear weapons is as high as it's been since the Cold War. Like we are in dire straits. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which you may be familiar with, but they every year, place the doomsday clock at sort of the seconds to nuclear midnight, the seconds to as a measure of the existential threats we face. And now they take into account also disruptive technologies like AI and climate change. So it's a broader picture now, but they still include nuclear weapons. And they now have us 90 seconds to midnight, which is the highest it's ever been.
Ever been. That's right.
Yeah.
I looked at that just the other day in a
Yeah.
conversation and
Yeah.
realized that it is the highest it's ever
It's
been.
scary. And you and I may disagree on this. I don't actually believe that nuclear weapons make us safer. I don't trust, like, there aren't good safeguards for making sure that there's not like an accidental use. The president has too much power. It depends too much on who's, got their finger on that trigger. Um, I don't really believe deterrence works, but we can, we don't have to get into that. Um,
No, we
but
don't.
we may sit on different sides of that, but I just want to, say that.
I do want to say I appreciate what you're saying there. But I do realize that if you look at the world situation, we have gone a long time since World War II without another global conflict. Don't know how long we can continue that, but we have. Now, whether or not you like the fact that nuclear weapons, the MAD, mutually assured destruction, had anything to do with that or not, again, we have different perspectives on that. And I tell people, as long as anybody in the world has nuclear weapons, we're going to have as many or more. Just don't know where it's
I mean,
going to
there's been plenty of conflicts though. I mean, as we're seeing, um, even right now with Ukraine in Gaza, there's plenty of violence in the world, and both of those situations, they feel like they could lead to a global conflict.
yeah. And
It feels like we're on a hair trigger. I don't know if you've read, I'm sure you will read, I haven't read it yet. Annie Jacobson's new book, I'm sure you've heard of it, that came out this week, Nuclear War: A Scenario.
I
Um,
have it on order. It's on its way.
yeah, yeah. But like from what I've read about it, it outlines a very scary scenario by which, like, the way that the nuclear weapons system is set up now, we could get into a nuclear war by accident,
In
and
fact, we've come close to it a number of times.
we have. It's very terrifying. Yeah. Yeah. Um, anyways, but you asked me about the Kingston ash spill. So the Kingston steam plant is literally across the lake from my family's house. And so I could see the stacks.
Right.
They were a feature of the landscape.
I just recently heard they're going to change it from coal to gas.
Really? I didn't know that. I haven't followed
That
that.
just came out this week.
Okay. I don't know if I don't know what I think about that.
It's better than coal. I mean, anything, you know.
Yeah. Gas is not great either for the
No,
environment.
it's not.
Yeah.
And by the way, nuclear is the cleanest we're going to get to. Think about that.
Well, there's the waste problem, there's the waste problem.
Oh, we'll have breeder reactors that'll take care of that. There's still power in that waste.
Well, we can talk about that another
I know we
time.
could go a long ways on that, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the Kingston steam plant issue that
Yeah.
you're talking about.
Right. So yeah, so that happened, that we weren't at the house then. It was December of 2008 that the waste containment pond burst, and sent, tons of toxic coal fly ash with all kinds of contaminants into the water and the surrounding landscape. And then it wasn't, at least I didn't hear of it until about 10 years later that that cleanup workers had started to die. And it was pretty, the stories are pretty horrifying of workers being denied protective equipment, being made fun of when they had respiratory problems, being told that it was allergies, like really dismissed. And now people, dozens have died and many more are sick and ailing. And there've been a series of lawsuits that I believe are ongoing. So yeah, that was, it was when that happened around the same time I was starting to think about this history. So they kind of coincided. And I learned then that plant was built originally to power Oak Ridge because they needed more energy for the Cold War operations. And so these things were connected in my mind, and it was sort of a lesson in like, you can't just, right? Like, so with the plant, what I learned is that there was a lot more waste in there with the waste containment pond than people had said. And it had been patched multiple times. And so, and environmental scientists had recommended different ways to contain it that hadn't been followed. And so you don't know when that piece is going to burst forth, right? But like, secrets don't always seep. Sometimes they explode with disastrous consequences, So there was sort of a literal and a metaphorical resonance for me when this happened. Yeah, that's.
Well, that's good. Thank you for that. And again, I really do appreciate your efforts, and the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think you've done something that could not have been done from another perspective. Yours is unique.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate you sharing so candidly your family's dealing with mental illness and even your own personal concerns. Mm-hmm. And I really do appreciate you doing that. And I'm so proud of you for getting that Reed Award. I think that is a high honor, and I appreciate you for that.
Well, thank you.
Anything else you want to share with our viewers as we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for doing it, and appreciate you being willing to share with our viewers the what you said at the award. When I heard that, I just said, okay, I got to get her on here and let that be known by a wider audience. So appreciate you doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, this will wrap this session up. Sorry, Keith could not be with us today. He had a doctor's appointment this morning. So we'll get this record or put up on YouTube a little later today. And let me tell you about what's coming in the very near future. We're going to take just a little bit of time off. We're going to skip the next session. So it'll be about 3 weeks before we come back. But when we do, it will be our 100th episode of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. And what we decided to do is to bring the person back who has had the most views of anyone on any of our episodes. And that is Alan Carr. He's the historian for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And he's going to bring Bree Steeves with him. The two of them are working on a book that they are going to publish, and they're going to share that with us on our 100th episode of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. Thank you all for being with us, and I look forward to the next time we can be together.